Chapter 1. The Silent Darkness. Lila hadn't always been invisible. There was a time when people acknowledged her, when teachers praised her hard work, and classmates gave her shy smiles. But high school had a way of changing things. Slowly, people began to overlook her, not noticing the quiet girl who walked the hallways with her head down, avoiding the cliques and the loud laughter that filled the air. It was her second year when the teasing started, small things at first. Whispers behind her back, muffled laughter as she walked past. Lila had learned to live with it, to hide behind her books and hope that the storm would pass. But storms don't always pass. Sometimes they build until they become hurricanes, and Lila had no idea that one was brewing just for her. The group that tormented her wasn't large, just 5 of them, but they were relentless. Jake, the charismatic leader, had a way of pulling people into his orbit. Wherever he went, his entourage followed. Jenna, the queen bee, Tommy, the brute with more muscles than sense, Emily, who never spoke but always smirked, and Adam, the shadow who lingered in the background, always ready to laugh at whatever cruel joke Jake threw Lila's way. Together, they made life unbearable for Lila. It started with the insults: freak, weirdo, loser. Words flung carelessly, but each one hit her like a punch. She told herself that she could ignore it, that it didn't matter what they thought. But ignoring them only seemed to make things worse. One day, after gym class, Lila found her locker had been trashed, her books torn, her clothes dumped on the floor. Written across the inside of the locker door in permanent marker were the words, "You're nothing." That night, Lila cried herself to sleep. She wanted to fight back. But how do you fight people who get off on your pain? She told no one, not her teachers, not her mother, and certainly not her father. He had enough problems with his drinking, and her mother was too busy working 2 jobs to keep their heads above water. No, Lila suffered in silence, hoping that one day they would just get bored and move on. But they didn't. The day everything changed was cold, the kind of autumn afternoon where the wind cut through your clothes and the sky hung heavy with clouds. Lila stayed after school to finish a project alone in the library. By the time she left, the building was nearly empty. Only the janitors left cleaning up the remnants of the school day. She wrapped her coat tighter around her small frame as she stepped outside, her breath misting in the frigid air. As she crossed the schoolyard, she noticed a figure standing by the entrance to the gym. It was Jake, leaning casually against the wall, watching her. Her heart sank. She had hoped to make it through the day without seeing any of them, but luck was not on her side. She quickened her pace, eyes focused on the ground, praying he would just let her go. But Jake had never been one to let things go. "Hey, Lila," he called, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" Lila didn't respond. She knew better than to engage. "Come on, don't be like that," Jake said, pushing off the wall and walking toward her. "We're just having a bit of fun." She glanced up, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw that he wasn't alone. The rest of his group had appeared from around the corner, blocking her path. Jenna stood with her arms crossed, an icy smile on her lips. Tommy cracked his knuckles, as if preparing for a fight, and Adam and Emily lingered behind them, silent as always, but their eyes glinted with anticipation. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what they wanted, but she knew it wasn't good. Panic surged through her, and she turned, intending to run, but Tommy was faster. He grabbed her by the arm, yanking her back toward the group. "Let me go," Lila shouted, fear making her voice shake. "Relax," Jake said, stepping closer, his smile widening. "We just want to talk." Lila struggled against Tommy's grip, but it was like fighting against a wall. He was too strong, and the more she pulled, the tighter he held on. Tears stung her eyes as she realized there was no escape. She was trapped. "Please, just leave me alone," she begged, her voice trembling. Jenna laughed, a cold, harsh sound that cut through the air like glass. "Leave you alone? Oh, come on, Lila, you should be thanking us for paying you any attention at all." Jake stepped forward, his face inches from hers. His breath smelled like peppermint, but there was nothing sweet about the look in his eyes. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Always hiding, always pretending like we don't exist." Lila shook her head, too terrified to speak. "You're not better than us," Jake hissed. "You're nothing." And with that, the torment began. Lila didn't know how long it lasted. Time seemed to blur as they pushed her around, shoving her from one to the other like she was a toy. She stumbled, fell, and they laughed, the sound echoing in her ears like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. They taunted her, called her names, and when she tried to get up, Jenna kicked her back down. "Stop!" Lila screamed, but her voice was lost in the wind, swallowed by the cold indifference of the world around her. At some point, she stopped fighting. Her body went numb, her mind retreating to a place where the pain couldn't reach her. She didn't feel it when they dragged her into the old gym building, didn't hear their cruel laughter as they surrounded her. All she knew was the darkness that crept into the edges of her vision, pulling her down into a place where there was no more fear, no more pain, no more anything. When it was over, they left her there, broken and bleeding, her spirit crushed. Jake and his friends never looked back. To them, she was already forgotten, just another casualty in their endless games. They buried her body in the woods behind the school, thinking that would be the end of it. No one would find her. No one would know. But some things don't stay buried. The days after Lila's disappearance were quiet. No one seemed to notice that she was missing. She had always been invisible, and her absence was no different. Her teachers assumed she had transferred schools, maybe dropped out, but no one asked any questions. Her parents, though concerned, assumed she had run away from the oppressive life she had always tried to escape. They filed a missing persons report, but the police had little to go on. She was just another lost girl, and the case quickly went cold. For weeks, Jake and his group went on with their lives as though nothing had happened. They whispered among themselves, made sure their stories lined up, and swore never to speak of that night again. But no secret stays hidden forever, and no crime goes unpunished. The longer Lila's body lay in that shallow grave in the woods, the more restless her spirit became. It started with small things that could easily be brushed off as coincidence or imagination. Jake would be walking home from school and feel a chill run down his spine, as if someone was watching him. When he turned around, there was never anyone there, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. He told himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, they had gotten away with it. No one knew. No one would ever know. But the whispers started next. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Jake would hear them when he was alone, in the quiet of his room late at night, or when he was walking through the empty halls of the school, a soft female voice just out of reach calling his name. Jake. He would stop, his heart racing, but when he looked around, there was never anyone there. He tried to shake it off, convinced that his guilt was catching up to him, that it was just his mind playing tricks. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Jake, you can't hide from me." The voice was unmistakable. It was Lila. The first time he saw her, it was in a dream. He was back at the gym, standing in the darkened room where they had left her. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and dust, the floor creaking under his weight. He could hear someone crying in the distance, a soft, broken sob that sent a chill down his spine. He turned, and there she was, Lila, standing in the corner, her clothes torn and bloodied, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. She was staring at him, her lips moving, but no sound came out. Jake tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, trapped by her gaze. Then she spoke. "You did this to me." Jake woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. Sweat soaked his sheets, and his hands shook as he wiped the tears from his eyes. It was just a dream, he told himself, just a nightmare. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Lila was haunting him, and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. The next day, Jake tried to shake off the dream, but Lila's face lingered in his mind. He couldn't focus in class, couldn't laugh with his friends like he usually did. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing there, accusing him with those hollow eyes. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't dare. But he wasn't the only one. Jenna had always prided herself on being fearless. She was the queen of the school, the one who could get away with anything. But lately, something had been different. She felt it too. The cold presence that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. At first, she ignored it, chalking it up to stress or paranoia, but the more it happened, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't real. One night, while getting ready for bed, she saw something that made her blood run cold. She was brushing her hair in front of the mirror when, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow move behind her. Jenna froze, her hand gripping the brush tightly as her heart raced. Slowly, she turned to look, but there was no one there. The room was empty. She tried to shake it off, but when she looked back at the mirror, her reflection wasn't alone. Standing just behind her, half hidden in the shadows, was Lila. Jenna screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over her vanity chair as she scrambled to get away. But when she looked again, the mirror was empty. Lila was gone. Trembling, Jenna turned on every light in the room, her mind racing. It couldn't be real. It was impossible. Lila was dead. She had made sure of that. But as she crawled into bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The room felt colder than it should have, the darkness pressing in around her. And just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard it. Soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Jenna. She sat up, her heart pounding, but the room was silent. The whisper was gone, but the fear remained. Lila was haunting her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The days blurred together as the haunting grew worse. Jenna started skipping school, too afraid to face the dark hallways where she knew Lila was waiting. Jake barely left his house, plagued by nightmares and whispers that followed him everywhere he went. The others, Tommy, Adam, Emily, weren't faring much better. They hadn't spoken about what they had done since that night, but now they didn't need to. They all knew the truth. Lila was back, and she wanted revenge. The group tried to ignore it, tried to convince themselves that they were imagining things, but the signs were impossible to ignore. Lila's presence was everywhere, her voice in the wind, her face in the shadows, her cold, accusing eyes watching them from every dark corner. No matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, they couldn't escape her. It was Jake who finally broke. He had been sitting alone in his room, the lights off, trying to silence the voices in his head, when he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He froze, his blood turning to ice as the familiar whisper filled his ears. "Jake, it's your turn." He screamed and bolted from the room, running blindly through the house, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop until he was outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. But even then, he could still hear her, Lila, whispering his name, calling him back to the place where it all began. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't live like this. Something had to be done. The next day, Jake gathered the others. They met in the woods behind the school, the same place where they had buried Lila's body. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the wind whispered through the trees like a warning. "We have to stop this," Jake said, his voice trembling. "We have to do something." Jenna shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "What can we do? She's dead, Jake. She's dead, and she's not coming back." "She already has," Tommy muttered, his usually confident voice now laced with fear. "We have to end this. We have to, I don't know, make it right somehow." But how could they make it right? There was no way to undo what they had done. They had killed Lila, and now she was coming for them. One by one, she would take them, just like they had taken her life. The group stood in silence, the weight of their guilt pressing down on them like a vice. They could feel Lila's presence, lingering in the air around them, watching, waiting. And then in the distance, they heard it. A soft whisper carried on the wind. Jake, Jenna, Tommy. One by one, Lila called their names, her voice echoing through the trees like a death sentence. The group froze, terror gripping their hearts as they realized the truth. Lila was coming for them, and there was no escape. Chapter 2. Unseen Eyes. The morning sun cast a pale light over the town, illuminating the streets and the empty schoolyard. The crisp autumn air seemed almost normal, but beneath the surface, an undercurrent of fear and tension simmered. For Jake and his group, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every whisper carried an edge of malevolence. Jake was the first to crack. After their meeting in the woods, he had tried to return to normalcy, but the presence of Lila's spirit was like a constant weight pressing down on him. His nights were plagued by nightmares, and his days were filled with a gnawing sense of dread that he couldn't shake. The once simple act of walking to school now felt like a trial, each step echoing with the ghostly whispers that had become his constant companion. That day, Jake was walking home alone, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the pavement. He had tried to ignore the whispers, tried to tell himself that they were just his imagination. But as he turned onto his street, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thick as if the world had suddenly become heavier. He quickened his pace, his breath visible in the cold air. As he approached his house, he saw a figure standing by the front door. It was a girl, pale and gaunt, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to stare right through him. Her clothes were tattered, her hair matted and dirty. It was Lila. Jake stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. He blinked, and she was gone. The door to his house stood open, the interior dimly lit by the setting sun. He took a cautious step forward, his legs trembling. He could still feel her presence, a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. He hesitated for a moment before entering his house, but the sight that greeted him inside made his blood run cold. His room was a mess. The drawers were open, their contents scattered across the floor. His bed was stripped of its sheets and the furniture was overturned. It looked as though someone or something had ransacked his room. Jake's heart raced as he glanced around, trying to make sense of the chaos. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Jake, you can't escape." He turned quickly, but the room was empty. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He grabbed his phone, dialing Jenna's number with shaking hands. When she answered, her voice was strained, her words punctuated by the same fear that gripped him. "Jake, what's happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's happening again," Jake said, his voice breaking. "She's here. Lila, she's in my house. My room is a mess. I don't know what to do." Jenna was silent for a moment. "I've been hearing things too," she finally said. "Seeing things. I thought I was losing my mind." "What should we do?" Jake asked, his voice desperate. "I don't know," Jenna said. "But we need to stick together. Maybe if we face this head on, we can find a way to stop it." Jake agreed, though he wasn't sure how much good it would do. The terror that had settled over him was suffocating. He couldn't stay in his house, not with the feeling of Lila's presence hanging over him. He decided to leave, to go somewhere, anywhere, away from the oppressive atmosphere of his home. As he stepped outside, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The air was colder than before, and the sky seemed to darken quickly. He made his way to Jenna's house, trying to push away the creeping sense of dread. When he arrived, he found her waiting for him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "I've been seeing her," Jenna said as she led him inside. "In the mirrors, in the shadows, she's everywhere." Jake nodded, his own fear evident. "I saw her too. At my house. She's not going away." The two of them huddled together in Jenna's living room, the lights on and the curtains drawn. They tried to talk through their fear, to make sense of what was happening, but the whispers never stopped. They filled the silence, a constant reminder that Lila was still out there, still waiting. In the corner of the room, a dark shape moved, just out of their sight. Jenna glanced over, but when she looked again, it was gone. Her heart raced, and she gripped Jake's arm tightly. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake shook his head. "I don't know. I'm not sure what's real anymore." The night wore on, the two of them talking in hushed tones, trying to comfort each other. But the fear was relentless. It seemed to seep into every corner of the room, every creak of the house. They could feel Lila's presence even when they couldn't see her. At some point, Jenna went to the bathroom. She turned on the light and looked into the mirror, her hands shaking as she splashed water on her face. When she looked up, she saw Lila standing behind her, a ghostly figure with hollow eyes. Jenna's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of shampoo. The bathroom was empty when she looked again, but the chill remained. When Jenna returned to the living room, her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "She was in the mirror," Jenna said, her voice barely a whisper. "She was right there." Jake's face went pale as well. "We need to do something," he said. "We need to find out why she's haunting us. There has to be a reason." Jenna nodded, though her fear was evident. "But what do we do? How do we stop this?" They were both at a loss. The fear was consuming them, making it hard to think clearly. They decided to try and reach out to the others, hoping that if they all came together, they might find a way to make sense of what was happening. Tommy was the next to answer their call. He had been avoiding them, too afraid to face what was happening. But when he heard their voices, he knew he couldn't hide forever. He arrived at Jenna's house, his face drawn and his eyes filled with the same fear that Jake and Jenna shared. "I've been seeing her too," Tommy said, his voice trembling. "In my house, in my dreams. She's everywhere." Adam and Emily were the last to join them. They arrived together, apart, their faces ashen and their bodies tense. They had been trying to ignore the haunting, hoping that if they didn't acknowledge it, it would go away. But now, they knew better. Lila's presence was undeniable. As they all gathered in Jenna's living room, the group tried to make sense of their experiences. They talked about the whispers, the shadows, the visions. Each one of them had seen Lila in different ways, but the message was the same. She was seeking revenge, and she wouldn't stop until she got it. "We can't keep running," Adam said, his voice resolute. "We need to face this. We need to find out what she wants." The group nodded in agreement. They knew that hiding wouldn't solve anything. They needed to confront their guilt, to understand why Lila was haunting them. But the fear was still there, a constant companion that made it hard to think clearly. As the night wore on, the group tried to piece together their experiences, searching for clues that might explain Lila's return. They knew they were running out of time. The haunting was growing more intense, more violent. They had to act quickly, or they would be consumed by their own fear. The whispers continued, a constant reminder of Lila's presence. They filled the room, echoing through the night. And as they sat together, trying to find a solution, they could feel the weight of Lila's anger pressing down on them, a chilling reminder that the ghost of their past was far from finished. Chapter 3: The Unforgiving Past. The morning light crept through the curtains of Jenna's living room, casting long shadows on the floor. The group had spent a restless night, their fear palpable. They had agreed to meet again in the morning to discuss their next steps, but sleep had been elusive, plagued by visions of Lila's ghostly form and the whispers that seemed to follow them everywhere. Jenna, Jake, Tommy, Adam, and Emily gathered in the dimly lit room, their faces drawn and weary. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their shared guilt pressing down on them. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls seeming to close in as the group tried to make sense of their situation. "We need to figure out why Lila is haunting us," Jake said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "There has to be something we missed, something we can do." Emily, who had been quiet for most of the night, spoke up. "What if she's not just haunting us? What if she's trying to tell us something? Maybe she wants us to understand what happened." Tommy nodded, though his face was etched with fear. "That makes sense. We need to look into her past, find out what happened to her before she died. Maybe there's a clue there." Jenna's face paled as she thought about the implications. "But how are we supposed to find out? We don't know anything about her life before the incident." Adam, who had been staring at the floor, looked up. "We could start by talking to people who knew her. Friends, family, anyone who might have information. There might be something we overlooked." The group agreed to this plan, though none of them were eager to relive the memories of that night. They split up, each taking a different approach to gather information about Lila. Jake and Jenna went to the local library to search for any public records or news articles about her. Tommy and Emily decided to visit Lila's old neighborhood to speak with her former neighbors and friends. Adam chose to reach out to Lila's family, hoping to gain insight from those closest to her. Jake and Jenna arrived at the library, the musty smell of old books filling the air. They settled into a corner with a stack of newspapers and microfilm archives. They began combing through the old articles, looking for any mention of Lila. The task was tedious, but they worked diligently, their eyes scanning the yellowed pages for clues. As they worked, Jenna glanced up at Jake, her face a mask of worry. "What if we don't find anything? What if this is all for nothing?" Jake shook his head. "We have to try. We need to understand what happened to her, why she's so angry. Maybe then we can find a way to help her move on." Hours passed, and their search yielded little. There were a few brief mentions of Lila in local news articles about her disappearance, but nothing substantial. Frustrated, Jenna sighed and leaned back in her chair. I don't know how much more of this I can take. I feel like we're just spinning our wheels. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the situation himself. We'll keep looking. We can't give up. Meanwhile, Tommy and Emily had arrived at Lila's old neighborhood, a quiet area with neatly kept lawns and white picket fences. They knocked on doors, introducing themselves and asking about Lila. Most of the neighbors were polite but had little to offer. A few remembered her as a quiet girl who kept to herself, but no one had any significant information. As they were about to give up, they met an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, who had known Lila's family for years. Mrs. Thompson invited them in for tea, and they sat in her cozy kitchen, the smell of freshly baked cookies filling the air. Yes, I remember Lila, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice soft and nostalgic. She was a sweet girl, always polite, but I heard she had some trouble at school. There were some rumors about her being bullied. Tommy and Emily exchanged glances, their interest piqued. Do you know who was involved? Emily asked. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. I don't know the details, but I do remember that she was having a hard time. Her parents were very private, so there was never much said about it. Their conversation with Mrs. Thompson provided a new lead. Tommy and Emily thanked her and left, determined to dig deeper into the rumors of bullying. They knew it was a significant piece of the puzzle, something they needed to explore further. Adam's task had been the most challenging. Reaching out to Lila's family proved difficult, as they had moved away shortly after her death. However, he managed to find a contact number for Lila's older brother, Mark. Adam hesitated before making the call, unsure of what to expect. When Mark answered, his voice was weary but polite. Adam explained the situation, his own fear evident in his voice. We're trying to understand what happened to Lila. We've been experiencing some unusual occurrences, and we think it's connected to her. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mark finally spoke, his voice cracking. I've heard rumors about people seeing her, that she's still out there, but I didn't want to believe it. We tried to move on, but it seems like she's still reaching out. Adam felt a chill run down his spine. Do you know anything about her life before she died? Anything that might help us understand why she's haunting us? Mark was silent for a moment. Lila was always a sensitive girl. She had a tough time fitting in, and she struggled with the bullying. We tried to protect her, but it didn't always work. I don't know if that helps, but that's all I can tell you. Adam thanked Mark and ended the call, his mind racing with the implications. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Lila's life had been marked by pain and isolation, and it seemed that her death had only intensified her anger. The group reconvened at Jenna's house later that evening. They shared their findings, each piece of information adding to the growing picture of Lila's life and the torment she had endured. It was clear that her death had not been the end of her suffering. Her spirit was restless, fueled by the unresolved anger and pain of her past. Jenna looked around at her friends, her face pale and drawn. We need to do something. We need to find a way to help her find peace. Jake nodded, his determination renewed. We'll keep looking, keep searching for answers, but we have to be careful. Lila's anger is powerful, and we don't know what she's capable of. The group agreed, though the fear was still evident in their eyes. They knew they were walking a dangerous path, but they were driven by the need to understand and to find a way to put Lila's spirit to rest. As they prepared to leave, the whispers returned, echoing through the room with a renewed intensity. The group tensed, their fear rising. They could feel Lila's presence, a chilling reminder that their journey was far from over. The night outside was dark and foreboding, the sky heavy with clouds. As they parted ways, each member of the group felt the weight of their guilt and fear. They knew that Lila's vengeance was far from over, and the path to redemption was fraught with danger. The echoes of the past were closing in, and the group was determined to face the darkness, no matter what it took. Chapter 4. The Gathering Storm. The chill of early November wrapped around the town like a shroud. the bare trees standing sentinel against the overcast sky. The days were growing shorter, and the darkness seemed to come sooner each evening. For Jake, Jenna, Tommy, Adam, and Emily, the encroaching darkness felt like a physical presence, a reminder of the malevolent force that had taken hold of their lives. They had spent the past few days piecing together the fragments of Lila's past, trying to understand the reasons behind her relentless hauntings. The more they learned, the more they realized how deep the scars of her life had run. Each piece of information painted a picture of a girl tormented by bullying, isolation, and a tragic death that had left her spirit restless and vengeful. Their latest discovery had come from Mark, Lila's older brother, who had revealed that Lila had been the victim of severe bullying at school. It was a revelation that added weight to their growing sense of dread. The knowledge that her tormentors were still out there, living their lives, only fueled Lila's anger and their own resolve to find a way to end the haunting. That evening, the group gathered at Jenna's house once more. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. They had agreed to meet and discuss their next steps, but none of them were prepared for the ominous signs that seemed to be closing in on them. Jenna looked around at her friends, her eyes tired but determined. "We've gathered a lot of information, but we still don't know how to put it all together. We need a plan." Tommy nodded, his face grim. "We need to figure out who was responsible for the bullying. We need to find out if there's anything specific that Lila wants from us. Maybe if we understand what she's looking for, we can find a way to help her move on." Emily, who had been quiet, spoke up. "There's something else we need to consider. Lila's anger is directed at us, but what if there's more to it? What if she's not just seeking revenge, but also trying to communicate something important?" Adam's expression was serious as he added, "We've all seen her. We've all felt her presence. But we need to find out if there's a way to communicate with her directly. Maybe if we can understand her message, we can find a way to make things right." The group agreed, though each of them felt the weight of their fear pressing down on them. The idea of trying to communicate with Lila directly was both terrifying and necessary. They needed to take a step forward, no matter how daunting it seemed. Jake suggested they start by revisiting the places connected to Lila's past. They needed to understand her life and her final days better, and they hoped that visiting these locations might provide some clues. The group agreed, and they planned to start with Lila's former school, where the bullying had taken place. The next day, they arrived at the school, a large, imposing building with a sprawling campus. The school had an air of normalcy about it, but beneath the surface, it was a place where Lila had suffered greatly. The group stood outside, looking up at the building, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and determination. Jenna led the way, her heart pounding as she approached the entrance. The school was closed for the weekend, but they had arranged for a tour of the facility through the administration, hoping to get a better sense of the environment where Lila had spent her final years. As they walked through the hallways, the silence was almost oppressive. The walls were lined with colorful student artwork, but the vibrant displays did little to alleviate the sense of dread that hung over the group. They followed the school's guide, a friendly woman named Mrs. Clark, who showed them around the campus. "This is where Lila spent most of her time," Mrs. Clark said, pointing to a classroom. "She was a quiet student, but she was very bright. We were all shocked when we heard about her death." Jake glanced at Jenna, who nodded. "Can you tell us anything about her interactions with other students? Any problems she might have had?" Mrs. Clark looked thoughtful. "Lila was often seen with a small group of friends, but there were rumors about her being bullied by some of the other students. I don't know all the details, but it was known that she had a tough time fitting in." The information confirmed what they had already learned, but it didn't provide any new insights. The group continued their tour, visiting the cafeteria and the gymnasium, but each location seemed to reinforce the sense of isolation and discomfort that Lila must have felt. As they left the school, the sky was growing darker and a cold wind blew through the air. The group headed to Lila's former neighborhood, hoping to gather more information from the people who had lived near her. They arrived at the neighborhood, a quiet area with neat houses and well-kept gardens. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil Lila had experienced. They knocked on doors, talking to neighbors and asking about Lila's life. Most of the responses were polite, but offered little in the way of new information. Just as they were about to give up, they met a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Sanders, who had lived next door to Lila's family. Mrs. Sanders invited them in, offering tea and cookies as they sat in her cozy living room. "I remember Lila," Mrs. Sanders said, her voice soft. "She was a sweet girl, but she had a rough time. Her family tried to protect her, but there was only so much they could do." Tommy leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Do you know who was responsible for the bullying? Were there any specific students who targeted her?" Mrs. Sanders looked troubled. "I don't know all the details, but there were a few troublemakers in the school. I heard that Lila had a run-in with a group of students who were known for causing problems. The information was frustratingly vague, but it was a lead they needed to follow." The group thanked Mrs. Sanders and left, their minds racing with the implications of what they had learned. As they regrouped at Jenna's house, they reviewed their findings. They had gathered a lot of information, but still lacked the crucial details needed to understand Lila's tormentors and her final moments. Jenna looked around at her friends, her face a mix of worry and determination. "We need to focus on finding out who was behind the bullying. We need to understand their role in what happened to Lila." Jake nodded in agreement. "We're getting closer, but we need to be careful. Lila's anger is growing, and we don't know what she's capable of." The group agreed, knowing that their next steps were crucial. They needed to find the answers that would help them understand Lila's anger and find a way to help her move on. As they prepared to leave, the air grew colder and the sky darkened further. The whispers seemed to follow them, a constant reminder of the restless spirit that was determined to see her vengeance fulfilled. The storm was gathering, and the group knew that they were heading into dangerous territory. The echoes of the past were growing louder, and they had to face the darkness head-on if they were to find a way to bring peace to Lila's tormented spirit. Chapter 5. The Secrets Unveiled. The days were slipping by in a blur of fear and determination. As November settled in, the air grew colder, and the dark evenings seemed to stretch endlessly. The group, Jake, Jenna, Tommy, Adam, and Emily, found themselves increasingly drawn into the enigma of Lila's vengeful spirit. Each step they took seemed to reveal new layers of her tragic story, but the final pieces of the puzzle remained frustratingly out of reach. The information they had gathered so far painted a picture of a troubled girl whose life had been marred by relentless bullying. Yet, the specifics of who had tormented her and how her life had ended remained unclear. The frustration of not having all the answers weighed heavily on them, but they knew they had to press on. One chilly evening, the group gathered at Jenna's house to review their findings and plan their next move. The atmosphere was tense, each member of the group lost in their thoughts. Jenna, her face tired but resolute, addressed her friends. "We need to narrow down our search," Jenna said. "We have some leads about the students who might have bullied Lila, but we need more concrete information. We need to find out who was responsible and what exactly happened." Tommy nodded. "I've been thinking, we should try to track down the students who were in Lila's class. They might have information or might remember details about what happened." Emily, who had been quiet, spoke up. "What about the teachers? They might have seen something or heard something. If we can find any who were there at the time, they might provide some insights." The group agreed on this approach. They decided to focus on contacting former classmates and teachers who might have witnessed the bullying or had knowledge of Lila's situation. It was a daunting task, but they knew it was crucial to getting the answers they needed. The following day, they split up to tackle their new leads. Jake and Jenna went to the local school district office to request records and contact information for former students and teachers. They hoped that the records would provide a list of potential contacts and some details about the events surrounding Lila's time at school. Tommy and Emily set out to find Lila's former classmates. They began by reaching out to people on social media, searching for anyone who had been in Lila's class. They hoped that by finding some of her peers, they could uncover new information about her experiences and the individuals involved in the bullying. Adam, meanwhile, focused on contacting former teachers. He started by calling the school where Lila had attended, speaking with staff members who had been there during her time. He hoped to find someone who might have observed the bullying or could provide information about Lila's final days. The process was slow and challenging. Many former students and teachers were reluctant to speak about the past, and some were outright hostile. But gradually, they began to piece together a clearer picture of Lila's life and the events leading up to her death. Jake and Jenna discovered that Lila had been a student in a particularly rough class, one known for its troublemakers. The school records provided some names, but many of the students had moved away or were difficult to track down. Tommy and Emily managed to locate a few of Lila's former classmates who were willing to talk. One of them, a girl named Sarah, recalled Lila being targeted by a group of students who had a reputation for bullying others. "I remember Lila," Sarah said when they met her at a local cafe. "She was always so quiet, and there were these guys who would pick on her all the time. They were cruel, calling her names, pushing her around. It was awful." Tommy pressed for more details. "Do you know who was in that group? Any names?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "There were a few of them, Jake, Mark, and Tom. They were the main ones, but there were others who joined in sometimes. They made her life a living hell." Emily took notes as Sarah spoke, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. "Thank you for telling us. We're trying to understand what happened to Lila, and any information helps." Adam's efforts to contact former teachers were met with mixed results. Many were unwilling to discuss their past students, but he eventually found a teacher who remembered Lila. Mrs. Collins, a former English teacher, had been at the school during Lila's time. When Adam met with Mrs. Collins, she was sympathetic but cautious. "I do remember Lila," she said. "She was a bright student, but she had a difficult time. I recall hearing about some bullying, but it was all very hush-hush. The school tried to handle it quietly, but it didn't always work." Adam pressed for more details. "Do you know who was involved? Was there any particular incident that stood out?" Mrs. Collins thought for a moment. "There was one incident that I remember clearly. It was just before Lila's death. There was a confrontation in the hallway, and she was badly shaken afterward. I don't know all the details, but it was clear that she was struggling." Armed with this new information, the group reconvened at Jenna's house. They shared their findings, each piece adding to the growing understanding of Lila's tragic story. Jenna looked around at her friends, her face a mixture of determination and anxiety. "We now know some of the names of the people who were involved in the bullying. We need to find them and see if they can shed any light on what happened." Jake nodded. "We also need to understand more about the incident Mrs. Collins mentioned. It sounds like it might have been a turning point for Lila." The group agreed to focus on tracking down the individuals named by Sarah and finding out more about the confrontation described by Mrs. Collins. They knew that time was running out and that Lila's anger was growing more intense. They had to act quickly to uncover the truth and find a way to bring peace to her restless spirit. As they prepared to leave, the whispers seemed to grow louder, echoing through the room. The group felt a renewed sense of urgency, knowing that Lila's vengeance was far from over. The darkness outside was thickening, and the air was heavy with anticipation. The storm of Lila's wrath was gathering strength, and the group knew that they had to face it head-on if they were to find a resolution. The secrets of the past were being unveiled, and with each revelation, the path to Lila's peace became clearer. But the journey was fraught with danger, and they had to navigate the treacherous waters of Lila's anger and their own guilt. As the night descended, the group braced themselves for the challenges ahead, knowing that the echoes of vengeance would continue to resonate until the truth was fully revealed. Chapter 6: The Confrontation. The group's determination had only grown stronger as they delved deeper into Lila's past. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and they were inching closer to understanding the full extent of her suffering and the individuals responsible. Yet, with each revelation, the tension in the air grew more palpable, and the sense of urgency became even more pronounced. The names they had uncovered, Jake, Mark, and Tom, were significant. They were the individuals identified by Lila's former classmates as the primary bullies, and the group knew that finding them was crucial to uncovering the truth. The confrontation described by Mrs. Collins was also a critical piece of the puzzle, and they were determined to understand it fully. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, the group gathered once more at Jenna's house. The atmosphere was tense, the air filled with a mix of anticipation and dread. Jake, Jenna, Tommy, and Emily sat around the table, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single lamp. They reviewed their findings, preparing to confront the individuals who had been implicated in Lila's torment. "We've tracked down Jake, Mark, and Tom," Jenna said, her voice steady despite the nerves that gripped her. "Jake and Mark still live in town, but Tom moved away several years ago. We need to decide how to approach them." Emily, who had been quiet, spoke up. "We should start with Jake and Mark. They're here, and they might be more willing to talk. Tom might be harder to find, but we can try to track him down later if necessary." The group agreed, and they decided to split into pairs. Jake and Jenna would visit Jake, while Tommy and Emily would go to Mark's house. Adam, who had been investigating the incident with Mrs. Collins, would stay behind to review any additional information they had gathered. As the group prepared to leave, the whispers seemed to grow louder, echoing in the stillness of the night. The air was thick with tension, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on them. Jake and Jenna arrived at Jake's house, a modest home in a quiet part of town. The lights were on, and they could see movement inside. Jake, who had been one of the bullies, was in his mid-30s now, but there was a hardness in his eyes that spoke of a troubled past. They knocked on the door, and after a few moments, Jake answered. His expression was guarded as he looked at the two visitors. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, his voice cautious. Inna stepped forward, trying to keep her tone neutral. "We're here to talk about Lila. We've been looking into her past and the bullying she experienced." Jake's face tightened, and he glanced nervously at Jenna and Jake. "I don't know what you're talking about. That was a long time ago." Jenna tried to remain calm. "We know that you were involved in the bullying. We're trying to understand what happened and why Lila's spirit is so angry." Jake's demeanor changed, and a flicker of guilt crossed his face. "Look, I didn't think it would come to this. We were just kids, and we did some stupid things, but I never meant for it to go this far." Jenna pressed on. "What happened in the hallway? We've heard that there was a significant incident that affected Lila deeply." Jake hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "I don't want to relive that. It was a bad situation, and I'm sorry for what happened, but I can't change the past." Jenna's frustration was evident. "We need to know what happened. It's important for understanding why Lila is still here and how we can help her." Jake sighed and looked away. "It was a confrontation between Lila and the group of us. We cornered her in the hallway, and things got out of hand. I don't remember all the details, but I know she was really shaken afterward. We didn't realize how much it would affect her." Meanwhile, Tommy and Emily had arrived at Mark's house, a larger home on the outskirts of town. The lights were dim, and there was an air of quietness about the place. They knocked on the door, and after a moment, Mark answered. Mark was in his early 30s, his face showing signs of weariness and regret. He looked at Tommy and Emily with a mix of apprehension and resignation. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his voice low. Emily spoke up, trying to convey a sense of urgency. "We're here to talk about Lila. We've been investigating her past and the bullying she experienced. We need to understand more about what happened." Mark's expression hardened, and he glanced nervously at the two visitors. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but I've moved on from all that. I don't want to dredge up the past." Tommy pressed on. "We're trying to help Lila. Her spirit is restless, and we need to understand what happened to her to find a way to put her to rest." Mark's face softened slightly, and he sighed. "I was part of the group that bullied Lila. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. We were all part of a crowd, and we didn't think about the consequences of our actions. Emily looked at Mark with a mixture of sympathy and determination. Do you remember anything specific about the confrontation in the hallway? Anything that might help us understand why Lila's spirit is so angry? Mark's eyes grew distant as he recalled the past. I remember the day clearly. Lila was cornered, and things got out of hand. We were trying to intimidate her, and it got physical. I don't remember everything, but I know she was crying and scared. It was a terrible moment. The revelations from Jake and Mark were significant. They painted a clearer picture of the torment Lila had endured and the confrontation that had led to her final days. The group's understanding of the events was deepening, but there was still much to uncover. As Jake and Jenna left Jake's house and Tommy and Emily departed from Mark's, they reconvened at Jenna's house to discuss their findings. The sense of urgency was growing, and they knew that they had to act quickly to address Lila's restless spirit. Jenna looked around at her friends, her face a mix of determination and concern. We've learned a lot, but we still don't know everything. We need to understand more about the confrontation and how it led to Lila's death. Jake nodded in agreement. We need to find out if there are any more details we're missing. We also need to find Tom, the last person involved, and get his side of the story. The group agreed to continue their investigation, knowing that time was running out. They had made significant progress, but the path to understanding Lila's torment and finding a way to help her move on was still fraught with challenges. As they prepared to leave, the whispers grew louder once more, echoing through the room with a sense of urgency. The storm of Lila's vengeance was gathering strength, and the group knew that they had to face it head-on. The night outside was dark and foreboding, the sky heavy with clouds. The echoes of the past were closing in, and the group braced themselves for the trials ahead. They were determined to uncover the truth and find a way to bring peace to Lila's tormented spirit. The confrontation with the past was far from over, and the path to redemption was fraught with danger. But the group was resolute in their mission, knowing that the echoes of vengeance would continue to resonate until the truth was fully revealed. Chapter 7. Unraveling the Darkness. The early winter night wrapped the town in an inky blackness, the stars obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. The chill in the air seemed to echo the growing tension among the group. The revelations from Jake and Mark had shed light on the extent of Lila's suffering, but the final piece of the puzzle remained elusive. The name Tom hung over them like a dark cloud, the last known person involved in the bullying. The group, Jake, Jenna, Tommy, Adam, and Emily, had reconvened to strategize. They needed to track down Tom and understand his role in the final, fateful moments of Lila's life. It was clear that his actions, or inactions, might hold the key to unraveling the full story of her torment and finding a way to bring her spirit peace. Jenna sat at the head of the table, her face illuminated by the dim light of a single lamp. We've learned a lot, but we still don't know where Tom is. We need to track him down and get his side of the story. We also need to understand more about the final confrontation and how it led to Lila's death. Adam, who had been researching Tom's whereabouts, spoke up. I've managed to find out that Tom moved to a neighboring town a few years ago. He changed his name and tried to distance himself from his past. It won't be easy to find him, but we need to try. Tommy, who had been pacing nervously, nodded. We should start by checking the records in the town he moved to. If we can find his new address or any leads, we might be able to locate him. The group agreed, and they decided to split up once more. Jake and Jenna would travel to the neighboring town to search for Tom, while Tommy, Emily, and Adam would continue to piece together the details of the confrontation from their earlier interviews. The next day, Jake and Jenna set out for the neighboring town. It was a small, quiet place, its streets lined with neatly kept houses and small businesses. They began their search by visiting the local records office, hoping to find any information that could lead them to Tom. As they entered the office, a woman behind the counter looked up with a friendly smile. How can I help you? Jenna took the lead. We're looking for a person who used to live here. His name is Tom, and we believe he moved here a few years ago. The woman's expression grew more serious as she checked the records. I'll need a bit of time to look through the archives. It might take a while. Jake and Jenna waited anxiously, their nerves fraying as the minutes ticked by. They used the time to discuss their approach and how they would handle the confrontation with Tom if they managed to find him. Finally, the woman returned with a list of addresses. I found a few possibilities. There's a Tom living at this address and another one who used to live there but has moved. You might want to start with the current resident. Jake and Jenna thanked her and headed to the address provided. The house was a modest, single-story home with a well-kept lawn. They approached the front door, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They knocked, and after a few moments, a man in his early 30s answered. He looked at them with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Yes?" he asked, his tone guarded. Jenna introduced herself. "We're looking for Tom. We believe he used to live here." The man's expression shifted to one of recognition. "Tom, you must be looking for my brother. He moved out a few years ago, but I can give you his new address if you'd like." Jake and Jenna exchanged glances, relieved to have a lead. They thanked the man and received the new address, which was located in a different part of town. They arrived at the new address, a modest apartment building on the outskirts of town. The building seemed quiet, and the air was thick with anticipation as they approached Tom's apartment. Jake knocked on the door, and after a few moments, Tom answered. He looked older and more haggard than they had expected, his face lined with signs of stress and regret. "Can I help you?" Tom asked, his voice hesitant. Jenna took a deep breath. "We're here to talk about Lila. We know you were involved in the bullying, and we need to understand what happened." Tom's face paled, and he stepped back from the door. "I don't want to talk about that. It was a long time ago, and I've tried to forget it." Jake stepped forward. "We need to understand what happened. Lila's spirit is restless, and we're trying to find a way to help her move on." Tom looked conflicted, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Finally, he sighed and let them in. "Fine, I'll tell you what I know, but I don't know if it will help." They entered the apartment, which was sparsely decorated and had a somber atmosphere. Tom sat down at the table, his face troubled. "It was a bad situation," Tom began, his voice shaking slightly. "We all had our reasons for being cruel, but I regret what happened. I remember the confrontation in the hallway. We pushed her too far. I didn't mean for it to get that bad, but we were all caught up in the moment." Jenna leaned forward. "What exactly happened during that confrontation? How did it lead to her death?" Tom's eyes filled with tears. "We cornered her, and things escalated quickly. I didn't realize how much pain we were causing her until it was too late. I think she was pushed too hard, and she was found dead later. I don't know if it was directly from that, but I know she was deeply affected." Jake's face was grim as he listened. "Do you know if there were any other incidents or details that might help us understand why her spirit is so angry?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know. I wish I could change what happened, but I can't. I'm sorry for what we did." As Jake and Jenna left Tom's apartment, they felt a mixture of relief and sadness. They had finally spoken to the last person involved, and his account provided more context to the tragic events. However, they were still left with the challenge of finding a way to help Lila's restless spirit find peace. Back at Jenna's house, Tommy, Emily, and Adam had been busy piecing together the details from their interviews. They reviewed the information they had gathered and tried to make sense of the various accounts. Adam looked at the group, his face thoughtful. "We have a clearer picture now, but we still need to understand more about the impact of the confrontation on Lila's spirit. We need to find a way to address her anger and help her move on." Emily nodded in agreement. "We've learned a lot, but the final step is to find a way to communicate with her and address her needs. We need to understand what will help her find peace." The group agreed to focus on finding a way to communicate with Lila directly. They planned to use the information they had gathered to set up a way to reach out to her spirit and understand her needs. As the night deepened, the whispers seemed to grow louder, echoing through the room with a sense of urgency. The storm of Lila's vengeance was approaching its climax, and the group knew that they had to act quickly to find a resolution. The path to redemption was fraught with challenges, but the group was determined to uncover the truth and help Lila's spirit find the peace she deserved. The echoes of vengeance were growing stronger, and they had to navigate the darkness to bring light to her troubled soul. The final confrontation with the past was near, and the group braced themselves for the trials ahead. The darkness was closing in, and they had to face it head-on to find a way to bring closure to Lila's restless spirit. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. The chill of early winter seeped into the bones of the town, its quiet streets blanketed by a layer of snow that shimmered under the pale light of the moon. The group, Jake, Jenna, Tommy, Adam, and Emily, had gathered once more at Jenna's house, their faces drawn with fatigue, but their resolve unwavering. They had made significant progress, but the true nature of Lila's spirit and the final resolution remained elusive. Tom's account had added crucial details to their understanding, but the lingering question of how to address Lila's anger and help her find peace still loomed large. The confrontation in the hallway had been a turning point, but they needed to delve deeper into the emotional and psychological impact it had on Lila to find a way to bring her spirit closure. Jenna began the meeting, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We've gathered a lot of information, but we still need to understand what will help Lila move on. We need to find a way to communicate with her spirit directly and address her needs." Adam nodded. "We've learned about the confrontation and the role each person played, but we need to find out what Lila's spirit truly wants. We need to establish a connection and hear her side of the story." Emily, who had been researching methods for spirit communication, spoke up. "I've come across some techniques for establishing contact with restless spirits. We can try using these methods to reach out to Lila and understand what she needs to find peace." The group agreed to try the communication techniques Emily had researched. They prepared a small, quiet room in Jenna's house, setting up candles and placing a table in the center. The atmosphere was tense as they arranged everything according to the guidelines Emily had provided. As the evening wore on, the room grew darker, illuminated only by the flickering candlelight. The group gathered around the table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the candles. Emily began the process, her voice calm and focused as she guided the group through the steps. "We need to be respectful and patient," Emily said. "The goal is to establish a connection with Lila's spirit and understand her needs. We need to be open and receptive to any messages she might send." The group fell silent, the only sounds being the soft crackle of the candles and the occasional rustling of clothing. They waited, their breath coming in steady, controlled rhythms. For a long while, nothing happened. The silence was heavy, filled with a sense of anticipation and unease. The group remained focused, their eyes fixed on the flickering candles in the center of the table. Then, a soft, cold breeze swept through the room, causing the candles to flicker and cast dancing shadows on the walls. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the group shivered as a sense of presence enveloped them. Jenna spoke softly into the silence. "Lila, if you're here, we want to understand what you need to find peace. Please, let us know what you want." The room remained quiet for a moment, and then a faint, sorrowful voice seemed to echo through the room. It was a whisper, barely audible, but filled with a deep sense of pain. "I want to be heard. I want justice." The group listened intently, their hearts heavy with the weight of Lila's words. The voice was faint, but filled with a profound sadness that seemed to resonate with the very core of their being. Emily took a deep breath and spoke gently. "Lila, we hear you. We understand that you want justice. We're here to help you. Please tell us more about what happened and what you need." The voice grew slightly clearer, though still hauntingly distant. "They left me alone. No one cared. I was forgotten." Tears filled Jenna's eyes as she listened. "We're so sorry, Lila. We're trying to find out what happened and to give you the justice you deserve. What can we do to help you move on?" The voice seemed to grow stronger, filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "They must know. They must understand what they did." The group exchanged glances, their determination reinforced by Lila's words. It was clear that she wanted the people responsible to truly understand the impact of their actions and to be held accountable for the suffering they had caused. Adam spoke up, his voice resolute. We need to make sure that everyone knows the truth about what happened. We need to make sure that the people involved understand the full extent of their actions and the pain they caused. Jenna nodded in agreement. We'll do everything we can to ensure that Lila's story is told and that those responsible are held accountable. We want to honor her memory and help her find peace. As the group continued to communicate with Lila's spirit, the room grew colder, and the presence of her spirit seemed to become more palpable. The voice continued to whisper, conveying a deep sense of pain and a desire for recognition and justice. After what felt like an eternity, the whispers began to fade, and the room grew still once more. The candles flickered gently, their light casting a soft, reassuring glow. The presence of Lila's spirit seemed to recede, leaving the group in a heavy silence. Emily looked around at her friends, her face reflecting a mix of relief and sadness. We've made contact with Lila. She wants justice and recognition for the pain she endured. We need to make sure that her story is heard and that those responsible understand the full impact of their actions. The group agreed, their resolve strengthened by the encounter with Lila's spirit. They knew that the final step in their quest was to ensure that the truth about Lila's suffering was brought to light and that the individuals responsible faced the consequences of their actions. As they prepared to leave the room, the atmosphere was filled with a sense of quiet determination. The echoes of Lila's vengeance were still present, but there was a newfound clarity about how to address her needs and help her find peace. The group knew that their work was not yet done. They had to take the next steps to ensure that Lila's story was told and that justice was served. The path to redemption was still fraught with challenges, but they were committed to seeing it through to the end. As the night deepened, the whispers grew softer and the air seemed to clear. The group felt a sense of hope and purpose, knowing that they were one step closer to helping Lila's spirit find the peace she so desperately sought. Chapter 9: The Unveiling. The days following their communication with Lila's spirit were filled with a sense of urgency and purpose. The group, Jake, Jenna, Tommy, Adam, and Emily, knew that they had to act swiftly to ensure that Lila's story was heard and that those responsible faced the consequences of their actions. Their task was clear: bring Lila's suffering to light and demand justice for her. The town had become a quiet backdrop to their intense efforts, its streets still covered in snow, casting a serene and almost deceptive calm over the turmoil within. The group spent their days gathering evidence and preparing for the final push to reveal the truth about what happened to Lila. Jenna had taken the lead in organizing a public forum where they could present their findings. The event was set to take place in the town's community center, a venue large enough to accommodate the townspeople and media. The aim was to ensure that everyone knew the full story of Lila's suffering and the role played by those involved. Jake and Emily worked on preparing the presentation, compiling all the information they had gathered into a cohesive narrative. Tommy and Adam reached out to local media and influencers to ensure that the story would reach a wider audience. Their goal was to make sure that the truth could not be ignored or forgotten. The night before the forum, the group gathered at Jenna's house for a final review of their presentation. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a mix of anxiety and determination. They knew that the unveiling of Lila's story would be a pivotal moment, and they wanted to be prepared for any challenges that might arise. Jenna looked around at her friends, her face a mix of resolve and apprehension. Tomorrow is the big day. We need to make sure that everything is ready and that we're prepared to handle any reactions from the community. Emily nodded, her expression focused. We've done everything we can to ensure that the presentation is thorough and accurate. We need to be ready for the emotional responses and the questions that might come up. Tommy, who had been pacing nervously, spoke up. We need to stay calm and stick to the facts. Our goal is to honor Lila's memory and ensure that the truth is heard. Adam, who had been reviewing the final details of the presentation, added, We should also be prepared for any resistance. Some people might not want to hear this story, but we have to stand firm in our mission." The group spent the evening making final adjustments and rehearsing their parts of the presentation. As the night wore on, their resolve grew stronger, and they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The next morning, the community center was abuzz with activity as the event preparations were underway. The room was filled with rows of chairs, a stage for the speakers, and a large projector screen that would display the presentation. The air was thick with anticipation as the townspeople began to arrive, their curiosity piqued by the announcements about the forum. Jenna and her friends arrived early, making sure everything was in place. The group took their seats at the front of the room, their nerves evident, but their determination unwavering. They were ready to reveal the truth and honor Lila's memory. As the start time approached, the community center filled up with a diverse crowd, residents of the town, local media, and a few curious onlookers. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The group took their positions on the stage, and Jenna stepped forward to address the audience. "Thank you all for coming," Jenna began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We are here today to share a story that has been hidden for far too long, a story of pain, injustice, and the quest for truth. This is the story of Lila, a young woman whose life was cut short by cruelty and neglect." The audience listened in rapt attention as Jenna, Jake, Emily, Tommy, and Adam presented their findings. The presentation detailed Lila's experiences of bullying, the confrontation in the hallway, and the tragic events leading up to her death. They provided a clear picture of the suffering Lila had endured and the emotional and psychological impact it had on her. As the presentation progressed, the room was filled with a mix of gasps, murmurs, and expressions of disbelief. The emotional weight of Lila's story was palpable, and the audience was visibly moved by the account of her suffering and the call for justice. When the presentation concluded, Jenna opened the floor for questions and comments. The audience was eager to express their thoughts and seek clarification on various aspects of the story. Many of the questions were directed at the group, seeking more details about the events and the individuals involved. One of the first questions came from a local reporter. "What do you hope to achieve with this presentation? What is the next step in seeking justice for Lila?" Jenna took a deep breath before responding. "Our goal is to ensure that the truth about Lila's suffering is known and that those responsible are held accountable. We want to bring attention to the impact of their actions and ensure that Lila's story is remembered. We also hope that this will lead to a greater awareness of the issues of bullying and neglect." As the questions continued, the group remained composed, answering each one with clarity and conviction. They addressed concerns about the accuracy of their findings and the steps they had taken to verify the information. Their responses reflected their dedication to uncovering the truth and honoring Lila's memory. As the forum drew to a close, the atmosphere was charged with a sense of resolution. The audience had been confronted with the harsh reality of Lila's story, and the community was left to grapple with the implications of what they had learned. The group, feeling a mix of exhaustion and accomplishment, prepared to leave the community center. They had faced the challenge of revealing Lila's story to the public, and their mission to seek justice and recognition for her suffering was now in the hands of the community. As they left the building, the snow continued to fall gently, blanketing the town in a serene white. The group knew that their work was far from over, but they felt a sense of fulfillment in knowing that they had taken a significant step toward bringing Lila's spirit the peace it deserved. The echoes of Lila's vengeance had been heard, and the community now faced the task of reckoning with the truth. The path to justice was still unfolding, but the group was determined to see it through to the end, ensuring that Lila's memory was honored and her suffering acknowledged. Chapter 10: Resolution and Redemption. The aftermath of the public forum left the town in a state of uneasy reflection. The community center was abuzz with conversation as people processed the shocking revelations about Lila's tragic story. The group, Jake, Jenna, Tommy, and Emily, had poured their hearts into revealing the truth, and now the town faced the task of coming to terms with it. The group's mission was clear: help Lila's spirit find the peace she had been denied and ensure that those responsible face the consequences of their actions. The day after the forum, Jenna's house became the headquarters for the group's final push. They had received an outpouring of support from the community, with many people expressing their desire to contribute to the quest for justice. The task ahead was daunting. They needed to follow up on the reactions from the forum, ensure that the individuals involved in Lila's torment were held accountable, and finally find a way to help Lila's spirit move on. The group gathered in Jenna's living room, their faces etched with a mix of exhaustion and determination. The room was filled with notes, documents, and laptops as they reviewed the feedback from the forum and planned their next steps. Jake took the lead. "We've made a significant impact with the forum, but we need to follow up on the responses we've received. We need to ensure that those responsible are held accountable and that Lila's story continues to resonate with the community." Emily nodded in agreement. "We've received several offers of support from local organizations and activists. We should leverage these connections to amplify our efforts and push for further action." Tommy, who had been reviewing the media coverage, spoke up. "The media has been covering the story extensively, and there's been a lot of public outcry. We need to keep the pressure on and ensure that this doesn't fade from the public's memory." Adam, who had been coordinating with local officials, added, "I've spoken with some of the officials, and they're willing to look into the case further. We need to make sure they follow through and take action." The group divided their tasks to maximize their impact. Jenna and Emily focused on coordinating with local organizations and activists, aiming to generate continued support for Lila's cause. Jake and Tommy worked on maintaining media momentum, ensuring that the story remained in the public eye. Adam handled communications with local officials, pushing for concrete actions and accountability. As the days passed, the town began to grapple with the implications of Lila's story. There was a growing sense of urgency as community members organized rallies, petitions, and awareness campaigns to address the issues of bullying and neglect. The media continued to cover the story, with interviews, op-eds, and reports highlighting the need for justice and reform. The group's efforts bore fruit when a local activist organization took up Lila's cause, advocating for a review of the events surrounding her death and pressing for accountability for those involved. The organization's involvement added a new level of credibility and momentum to the campaign, attracting attention from both the community and the broader media. One evening, the group gathered once more at Jenna's house to review their progress. The room was filled with a sense of cautious optimism as they discussed the recent developments. Jenna looked around at her friends, her face reflecting both pride and exhaustion. "We've made a lot of progress. The public and media response has been overwhelmingly supportive, and the activist organization is pushing for real change. But we still need to see concrete actions from the officials." Adam, who had been in contact with the officials, spoke up. "I've been assured that an investigation into the events surrounding Lila's death is underway. There's been a commitment to review the case and hold those responsible accountable." The group was encouraged by the news, but they knew that their work was far from over. They continued to monitor the progress of the investigation and worked tirelessly to keep the public engaged and informed. As the investigation unfolded, the town began to see tangible results. There were public hearings, interviews with key witnesses, and discussions about the need for policy changes to address bullying and neglect. The community rallied behind the cause, and the pressure on the officials and those involved grew stronger. One afternoon, Jenna received a call from a local journalist who had been covering the story. "Jenna, I have some important news. The investigation has led to the identification of several individuals who were involved in the bullying and neglect. There's going to be a formal announcement soon." The group gathered to discuss the news, their faces a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The identification of those responsible marked a significant step toward justice, but it also meant that they would need to prepare for the fallout and ensure that the case continued to receive the attention it deserved. The day of the formal announcement arrived, and the community center was once again filled with people eager to hear the latest developments. The room was charged with a sense of expectation as officials took the stage to address the crowd. The announcement was both a relief and a call to action. The officials detailed the findings of the investigation, identifying the individuals involved in the bullying and neglect, and outlining the steps that would be taken to address the issues and prevent future occurrences. The community was informed that legal proceedings would follow, and there would be a focus on implementing reforms to address the underlying problems. The group, Jake, Jenna, Tommy, Adam, and Emily, watched the announcement with a mix of satisfaction and resolve. They had played a crucial role in bringing Lila's story to light and pushing for justice, but they knew that the real work was just beginning. As the crowd dispersed, the group gathered to discuss their next steps. They were determined to stay involved and ensure that the changes promised by the officials were implemented effectively. The coming weeks were filled with continued efforts to support Lila's cause and advocate for meaningful change. The group worked closely with local organizations, attended public meetings, and continued to engage with the media to keep the momentum going. The final chapter of Lila's story began to unfold as the legal proceedings took shape. The individuals responsible faced legal consequences for their actions, and there were discussions about the need for systemic changes to address the issues of bullying and neglect. Throughout this period, the group remained in contact with Lila's spirit, continuing to seek ways to help her find peace. They held a private ceremony to honor her memory, acknowledging the pain she had endured and celebrating the steps taken toward justice. The ceremony was a solemn but hopeful occasion. The group gathered in a quiet, peaceful spot, a place that felt like a fitting tribute to Lila. They lit candles and placed flowers in her honor, offering a moment of reflection and gratitude for the progress they had made. As they stood together, Jenna spoke softly. "We've come a long way, but there's still more work to be done. We've honored Lila's memory and fought for justice, and we need to ensure that her story continues to inspire change." The group agreed, their faces filled with a sense of fulfillment and determination. They had faced numerous challenges and obstacles, but they had remained committed to their mission and made a significant impact on their community. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the landscape, the group felt a sense of closure and hope. They had succeeded in bringing Lila's story to light, advocating for justice, and addressing the issues of bullying and neglect. The echoes of Lila's vengeance had led to meaningful change, and her spirit could finally find the peace it had longed for. The story of Lila's suffering and the quest for justice had come full circle, and the group knew that they had made a difference. Their efforts had not only honored Lila's memory, but had also sparked a broader movement for change, ensuring that her legacy would continue to resonate for years to come. As they parted ways, the group felt a deep sense of satisfaction and gratitude. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their hearts filled with hope for a brighter future. The echoes of vengeance had been transformed into a force for good, and Lila's spirit could finally rest in peace. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through Echoes of Vengeance. We hope you were captivated by every twist and turn of Lila's haunting tale. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to dive into more spine-tingling adventures, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear about our next thrilling story. We've got plenty more eerie tales and suspenseful journeys coming your way, and we don't want you to miss a single one. So stay tuned, and thank you once again for being part of our storytelling family.